Why the Stranger Never Blinks. Zubri stood completely frozen in the center of the silent village, right beside the vast, shimmering waters of the Great Lake. The damp, sandy clay beneath his bare feet offered absolutely no comfort. His intense brown eyes were heavily bloodshot, burning with a terrible fire. Slowly, agonizingly, crimson tears began to pool in the corners of his eyes, trailing down his obsidian-black skin. His lean, athletic muscles trembled uncontrollably beneath his coarse weave, ochre-orange cotton tunic. The fabric clung to his chest, damp with cold sweat from a chilling lake breeze. Towering directly over him was the Ashen Merchant, a nightmare dressed in a pristine, heavyweight white silk linen floor-length robe. The merchant's perfectly symmetrical features were frozen in a cruel, predatory smirk. His silver-gray eyes stared down with unnatural intensity, never wavering, never closing. The air between them was thick, suffocating, and heavy with ancient magic. "Blink, Zubri," the merchant whispered smoothly, his voice sliding through the silent air like dark oil over water. "Just once, and all this pain ends forever." Zubri forced his burning eyes to stay open. He knew the terrifying truth. If he closed his eyes for a single second, his immortal soul and his village would be lost to the darkness forever. Suddenly, his vision went entirely black. His eyelids began to drop. 3 weeks earlier, the fishing village of Alara was a sanctuary of peace. The community thrived in simple harmony right on the shores of the massive freshwater lake. Circular huts built from sun-dried red clay dotted the beautiful shoreline, topped with conical roofs woven tightly from golden-brown lakeside reeds. The villagers lived happily on the damp, sandy soil, sharing every fish they caught. There was no greed, only the quiet rhythm of the crashing waves. Then, without warning, the Ashen Merchant arrived. He walked out of the dense morning mist, rolling off the deep water, like a ghost stepping from the shadows. He was a towering figure, standing 6 feet and 3 inches tall, with a slender, serpentine build. His polished mahogany-black skin carried a strange, unnatural sheen that caught the sunlight bouncing off the lake. He wore a heavyweight white silk linen robe featuring a high mandarin collar. Miraculously, the pristine fabric remained entirely untouched by the wet sand and shoreline mud. The elders gathered cautiously to greet him, sensing a terrifying shift in the air. The merchant said nothing at first. He simply smiled, a thin, chilling curve of his lips, and unfastened the lock on a heavy wooden chest. As the lid creaked open, it revealed a glowing mountain of impossible riches. The corruption of the lakeside village of Alara began with shocking speed. The Ashen Merchant did not ask for land or labor. Instead, he began trading chunks of pure, heavy gold for the most menial everyday items. He gave a solid gold bar for a simple cup of lake water. He offered a handful of glowing coins for a plain woven fishing net. Almost overnight, the villagers, who had once shared every meal, began fiercely hoarding their possessions. Laughter was replaced by suspicious whispers. Doors that were always open were suddenly locked tight against neighbors. Zubri wanted no part of this madness. He stood silently by the massive mahogany trees lining the shore, his hands brushing against their deep green, waxy leaves. He refused to accept a single coin, watching his beloved community tear itself apart in real time. The final breaking point came on the 3rd day. Zubri witnessed something that completely broke his heart. His closest friend, a young man he had trusted since childhood, snuck into his own mother's hut. The friend stole her only remaining wooden canoe, desperately rushing to offer it to the strange visitor for another piece of useless metal. The moral fabric of the village was ruined. Zubri realized he was the only one left who saw the truth. Later that afternoon, a fierce and sudden wind kicked up across the vast lake. The heavy gust sent thick clouds of stinging lakeside sand swirling violently through the humid air. The villagers immediately dropped their tasks, throwing their hands over their faces and shutting their eyes tightly to avoid the blinding dirt. Zubri, however, merely shielded his brow and squinted to the hazy storm, watching the strange visitor closely. While everyone else panicked, the Ashen Merchant stood perfectly still on the wooden docks in the center of the chaos. He made no effort to protect his face. The swirling sand bounced harmlessly off his pristine white robe. More terrifyingly, His thin lips curved into a chilling, knowing smile, and his predatory silver-gray eyes remained wide open. He did not flinch. He did not tear up. The merchant never closed his eyes, not even for a fraction of a second. A cold dread washed over Zubri's entire body. He finally understood that the merchant was not a human being at all. He was something ancient, dark, and incredibly dangerous, wearing a clever human disguise. Just as the wind from the lake began to die down, the ashen merchant slowly turned his unblinking gaze directly onto Zubri, fully realizing he was being watched. That night, Zubri refused to sleep. He quietly crept out his clay hut and hid himself among the tall, swaying reeds growing near the merchant's newly built compound beside the water. The village was completely silent, plunged into an unnaturally deep slumber brought on by their newly acquired wealth. In the dead of the night, a horrifying scene began to unfold. Zubri watched as a faint, ghostly mist began pulling from the rooftops of the sleeping villagers' huts. The glowing vapor floated slowly through the cool air, funneling directly into the ashen merchant's open mouth as he stood silently facing the dark lake. The gold he had given them was never a gift. It was a dark, magical sedative designed to make them sleep deeply while he slowly consumed their life force and stole their souls. Zubri's heart hammered furiously against his ribs. He shifted his weight in the muddy shallows to get a better view, but his bare foot pressed down too hard on a brittle shell. A loud snap echoed sharply across the quiet water. The ghostly mist immediately snapped back into the huts. The ashen merchant's head whipped around with terrifying speed, his unblinking silver eyes staring directly into the dark, trembling lakeside reeds. The following morning, the ashen merchant actively sought out Zubri. He found the young man sitting alone on the sandy shore, meticulously mending a torn fishing net. The terrifying entity approached with smooth, silent steps, looking down at Zubri with absolute disdain. He cruelly mocked the frayed hem of Zubri's coarse weave ochre-orange tunic and the simple, dark brown hemp rope tied around his waist. "You live like a starving animal," the merchant whispered, his voice dripping with false pity. He reached into his wide sleeves and produced a folded robe of pure, shimmering gold silk. He offered Zubri endless wealth, promising him a massive fleet of ships and absolute control over the Great Lake. All Zubri had to do was look the other way and remain completely silent about what he had seen in the night. Zubri stood tall, his strong jawline set in firm defiance. He rejected the offering, refusing to sell his soul or betray his beloved people for empty riches. By doing so, Zubri officially made a sworn enemy of a powerful, supernatural being. The merchant's polite smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He leaned in closely and whispered, "By tomorrow morning, your own people will drop to their knees and beg me to kill you." Zubri knew he could not defeat ancient magic with mere physical strength. He urgently needed supernatural help. Without telling anyone where he was going, he quietly launched a small canoe and paddled away from Alara to find the oracle. He navigated a treacherous path across the Great Lake, heading toward the deepest, darkest part of the flooded mangrove forest. Unnatural, shifting shadows seemed to peel themselves away from the massive, twisted roots protruding from the dark water, whispering his worst fears and desperately trying to turn him back. Zubri kept his eyes firmly fixed ahead, refusing to let the dark magic break his resolve. If he did not reach the oracle before the sun rose again, he would have no weapon to use against the ashen merchant, and his village would perish. After hours of exhausting paddling, Zubri finally broke through the dense foliage and arrived at an isolated, hidden cove. A solitary, worn clay hut stood perfectly still, resting on tall wooden stilts directly over the black water. However, standing guard directly on the wooden dock was a massive, unnatural beast formed entirely of writhing black smoke, its glowing red eyes locked fiercely on the exhausted, brave young man sitting in the small wooden canoe. Zubri braced himself for a brutal attack, but the terrifying smoke beast suddenly dissolved into a harmless cloud of mist over the lake. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and an 80-year-old woman stepped out onto the stilted dock. It was the oracle. She stood barely 5 feet tall, severely hunched over with age. Her ancient onyx skin was covered in deep, textural wrinkles that mapped a lifetime of magical secrets. Her floor-length, silver-white micro-braids clicked softly, adorned with aged cowrie shells woven tightly into the tips. She wore a thick, indigo-blue hand-dyed wrap, covered in faded white concentric circle patterns that mirrored the ripples on the water. Before Zubri could even speak a single word, she raised a weathered hand. She already knew exactly why he was there. The dark magic of the village had disturbed the ancient lake. The oracle instructed Zubri to sit on the wooden planks, while she pulled a handful of sacred cowrie shells from her pouch. She muttered an ancient incantation and forcefully threw the shells onto the dock to read the village's fate. Zubri watched closely as every single shell landed violently cracked completely in half. The oracle slowly looked up at Zubri, her ancient eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror at the deadly reading. The oracle's voice trembled as she revealed the terrifying truth over the lapping waves. She explained that the Ashen Merchant was an ancient entity known as the Eater of Days. He did not desire earthly wealth. He traded exclusively in human souls. However, his dark magic had a very specific limitation. He could only steal a person's soul in an exact fraction of a second when their eyes were completely closed in sleep or surrender. He never blinked because his own eyes were the vulnerable gateway to his immense power. To defeat him, his magic had to be violently broken by his own biological reflex. The only way to save Alara was to force the ancient monster to blink, something he had not done in over 1,000 years. The oracle warned that physical weapons were entirely useless against him. Zubri had to formally challenge the entity to the gaze of the ancients, an unbreakable blood pact recognized by the earth and the Great Lake. It was a battle of pure endurance and willpower. If the merchant blinked, his magic would shatter. But the oracle delivered a grave warning. If Zubri failed and closed his eyes first, the ancient contract dictated that he would immediately forfeit his own immortal soul forever. Armed with this dangerous knowledge, Zubri paddled frantically back across the Great Lake. His muscles burned and his hands bled against the rough wooden oar, but he did not slow down. When he finally hit the shoreline and entered Alara, he gasped in absolute horror. The worst had already happened. The lakeside square, once filled with joyous laughter and music, was completely dead. The villagers wandered around the sandy beach like mindless zombies. Their skin was pale and sickly, and they were fighting viciously in the muddy shallows over tiny, worthless scraps of gold. The massive lake itself had turned stagnant, with dead silver fish washing up along the shore. Time was rapidly running out. His people were mere hours away from total spiritual consumption. Zubri yelled out, desperately trying to snap his friends out of their magical trance. Instead of greeting him, the villagers slowly turned toward him with blank, hollow eyes. Moved by the merchant's dark influence, they began to surround Zubri in a tight circle near the water. They raised sharp fishing spears and heavy wooden oars, their faces twisted into masks of mindless hatred. Zubri was completely trapped on his own shoreline, staring down the very people he was desperately trying to magically save. The angry crowd parted as the Ashen Merchant gracefully stepped out from his compound near the docks. His intricate gold thread geometric embroidery caught the bright afternoon sun, making him look like a dark, flawless god. He pointed a long, slender finger directly at Zubri and raised his voice for the entire village to hear over the crashing waves. He falsely accused Zubri of traveling into the forbidden mangrove swamp and bringing a terrible curse back upon their peaceful home. He claimed that Zubri's jealousy and dark witchcraft were the sole reasons the fish had died and sickness had spread. The entranced villagers blindly believed every single word. The merchant declared that the only way to restore their wealth and the health of the lake was to eliminate the traitor. Zubri was about to be brutally executed by the very people he loved. Before he could even attempt to defend himself or explain the truth, a heavy blow struck his legs. He was forcefully shoved to his knees in the wet lakeside sand. Zubri looked up in absolute horror to see his own older brother standing over him. His brother's eyes were clouded with dark magic as he pressed the cold, sharp edge of a scaling knife against Zubri's unprotected throat. Desperation fueled a sudden surge of adrenaline in Zubri's veins. With the cold steel pressing heavily into his neck, he took a deep breath and shouted the ancient incantation the oracle had taught him. With his last breath, Zubri formally invoked the gaze of the ancients. The moment the sacred words left his lips, The bright sky over the Great Lake instantly darkened, and a deafening rumble of thunder shook the water. The ancient, undeniable laws of the land physically bound the Ashen Merchant, freezing the hostile villagers in place. The merchant's glowing silver eyes widened in genuine surprise. He was trapped by the oldest magic of the earth. He could not refuse the challenge without instantly losing all of his accumulated power. The ultimate wager was officially set in stone. It would be Zubri's mortal soul matched against the merchant's magical control over the village of Alara and its waters. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The Ashen Merchant slowly lowered his hands, and his lips curled into a truly sinister smile, revealing a hidden row of terrifying, razor-sharp teeth. He looked down at the kneeling young man and whispered, "Your soul is mine. We begin precisely at sundown." As the sun began to slowly dip toward the distant horizon of the Great Lake, the entranced villagers moved in eerie unison. Acting as silent witnesses bound by the ancient magic, they dragged their bare feet to the damp sand, carving a wide, perfect circle right on the shoreline. Zubri stepped inside the boundary, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. The cold water gently lapped at his heels. A moment later, the oracle emerged from a wooden canoe to act as a magical referee. The aged cowrie shells woven into her silver-white braids clattered loudly in the dead silence of the evening. She raised her wooden staff and slammed it into the wet earth, officially locking contestants inside the arena. The rules were absolute. Neither combatant could move their feet from their chosen spot on the beach. The very first person to close their eyes for even a fraction of a second would lose everything they possessed. Zubri stared forward, locking his intense brown eyes onto the merchant's silver ones. The last sliver of sunlight vanished behind the dark water, plunging the lakeside village into deep, cold shadows. The ultimate test of endurance had officially begun, and there was absolutely no turning back for the brave young fisherman. The first hour brought a brutal, immediate physical torment. The night air blowing off the Great Lake was uncharacteristically dry and biting, whipping across the open shoreline. Without the protective moisture of a natural blink, Zubri's intense brown eyes began to burn fiercely. It felt as though hot lakeside sand was being forcefully rubbed directly into his pupils. The Ashen Merchant, however, stood completely effortlessly across the sandy circle. His wide silver eyes were unbothered, and his polished skin glowed with a faint, unnatural light in the pale moonlight reflecting off the water. Zubri's faded buzz cut dripped constantly with cold, nervous sweat, the salty liquid threatening to roll down into his vulnerable eyes. Zubri's fragile human limitations were becoming immediately and terrifyingly apparent. He was not just fighting a man. He was fighting a supernatural biology designed to endure forever. Every muscle in Zubri's face twitched as his body violently demanded the simple reflex of closing his eyelids. The pain was rapidly growing from a dull ache into an agonizing, sharp sting. Suddenly, the merchant smiled, and a harsh, directed gust of wind blew a handful of sharp beach sand directly into Zubri's exposed face. The real torture had finally begun, pushing his human body to its absolute breaking point. Realizing that physical pain alone might not break the boy quickly enough, the merchant decided to use his dark magic to attack Zubri's mind. He expertly preyed upon the universal human weakness of greed. Suddenly, the dark shoreline melted away. Zubri's vision warped completely, replacing the crashing waves with a breathtaking illusion of unimaginable wealth. He saw himself dressed in heavy, kingly robes made of the finest woven silk, sitting high upon a golden throne built over the water. He was surrounded by massive mountains of sparkling gold, precious gems, and a massive fleet of glorious ships stretching across the Great Lake. The illusion promised that he would never have to cast a heavy fishing net ever again. He could have absolute peace, comfort, and power for the rest of his life. Zubri had to fight a terrifying psychological urge to simply surrender to the overwhelming comfort being offered to his tired mind. The magical illusion was so incredibly realistic that Zubri could actually smell the sweet, rich spices overflowing from the phantom ships. The temptation was incredibly heavy, and slowly, dangerously, his exhausted eyelids began to flutter heavily under the immense weight of the magical assault. He was mere seconds away from losing the bet entirely. Zubri's vision swam, but a deep, stubborn strength rose within his chest. He desperately dug his bare toes deep into the damp, cold beach sand beneath him, grounding himself in the harsh reality of the physical world. He focused entirely on the rough, coarse-weave texture of his humble cotton tunic scraping against his tired skin and the familiar sound of real water lapping against the shore. He remembered exactly who he was, a simple, honest fisherman who loved his people more than he loved himself. He realized that stolen wealth would only build a gilded cage. With a massive surge of willpower, he mentally rejected the selfish desires, and the grand illusion of golden ships shattered into a million tiny pieces, dissolving back into the cold night air over the lake. The ashen merchant visibly flinched, realizing that this mortal man could not be easily bought or corrupted with simple greed. The merchant's silver eyes suddenly glowed with a fierce, blinding intensity as he prepared to escalate to a much darker and more vicious psychological tactic. He stepped forward slightly, his flawless face twisting into a mask of pure malice. "If you do not want to rule the waters," the merchant hissed through his teeth, "perhaps you want to drown in them." Having failed to corrupt Zubri with greed, the merchant viciously attacked his heart with absolute terror. The merchant projected horrifying, realistic visions directly into Zubri's mind. Zubri was forced to watch his beloved Great Lake begin to violently boil, roaring with unnatural green flames. He saw his closest friends decaying rapidly into dust as massive, shadowy waves crashed over the village right before his eyes. He watched the wise oracle slowly sinking beneath the dark, churning water, screaming out his name in utter agony. The auditory hallucinations were deafening. He heard the desperate screams of children begging him to just close his tired eyes and let the terrible suffering finally end. The emotional torment was completely unbearable, ripping his soul to shreds. The overwhelming grief bypassed his physical endurance. Without him even realizing it, hot, heavy tears began to stream down his obsidian-black cheeks. The tears stung his already burning eyes, multiplying the physical pain tenfold. He desperately tried to hold his gaze steady, but a large, heavy tear broke loose from his upper lashes. The droplet rolled directly over Zubri's dilated pupil, heavily blurring his vision completely and threatening to force his eyelids shut in a natural, protective biological reflex. He was completely blinded by his own profound sorrow. Standing at the edge of the sandy circle, the oracle saw Zubri breaking under the immense emotional weight. She knew she could not interfere physically, but she could provide a crucial spiritual assist. She slammed her staff down into the wet sand and began a low, highly rhythmic chant. As her ancient voice rose to the cold lakeside air, the white concentric circles died onto her indigo wrap, seemed to pulse with a faint, calming blue light. Her familiar, steady voice mimicked the natural, soothing rhythm of the lake tides, cutting directly through the merchant's dark illusions and reaching into Zubri's fractured mind. She gently reminded Zubri of the quiet, enduring beauty of the deep waters and the unyielding strength of the ancient earth beneath his feet. Guided by her wisdom, Zubri slowly regained his mental focus, pushing the terrifying nightmares away. However, his physical eyes were now reaching their absolute biological limit. The intense pressure and lack of moisture caused tiny, fragile capillaries within his eyes to finally burst. He was no longer weeping salty tears. He was weeping thick, crimson blood. The red fluid streaked down his face, a horrific testament to his unyielding willpower. He had survived the mental assaults, but his human body was actively failing him. The timeline had finally caught up to the agonizing climax. Zubri stood in the center of the lakeside village, weeping crimson tears while his athletic muscles trembled uncontrollably beneath his tunic. The ashen merchant leaned in closely, his pristine white robe glowing brightly against the pitch-black night over the water. "You are breaking, mortal," the merchant whispered smoothly over the sound of the crashing waves. "Give in. Just blink once, and all this pain ends." Zubri knew he had absolutely no physical strength left to continue this torture. Pure willpower alone was no longer enough to win this battle. He desperately needed a clever strategy. As his vision swam in a sea of red, he noticed something crucial about his enemy. Even in the midst of this brutal magical battle, the merchant kept adjusting his pristine robe, making sure no wet sand touched his hem. The merchant was perfectly symmetrical, incredibly vain, and completely obsessed with his own flawless, pristine image. He believed he was completely untouchable. That arrogance was a massive, glaring weakness. Zubri realized that he could not outlast a monster, but he might be able to use a monster's own blinding perfection against him. His heavy eyelids were dropping rapidly, but a desperate plan quickly formed in his exhausted mind. Zubri's vision was completely swimming in a hazy sea of red blood and exhaustion. His eyelids fluttered, desperately trying to close. Feigning total defeat, he let his shoulders slump and slowly reached his trembling hand deep into his frayed tunic. The merchant smiled triumphantly, assuming the young fisherman was reaching for a scaling knife to end his own life, or simply giving up the fight entirely. Instead, Zubri pulled out a highly polished, curved copper disc. It was a simple, everyday shaving mirror he used to maintain his crisp, natural hairline. The ashen merchant laughed out loud, a cold, mocking sound that echoed loudly across the dark lake. He foolishly believed Zubri had completely lost his mind to the pain and terror. Behind the merchant, the dark sky reflecting off the massive body of water was just beginning to turn a faint, glowing purple. The morning sun was finally beginning to peek over the distant watery horizon, casting its very first rays of light across the rippling surface. Zubri's hand shook violently, but he did not point the shiny copper disc at the merchant. Instead, he carefully angled the polished metal downward, pointing it directly at the wet sand by his feet. The merchant watched with amused curiosity, completely unaware of the deadly trap. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. As the very first intense, brilliant ray of the morning sun finally cleared the edge of the great lake, it shot directly across the vast expanse of rippling water. The immense surface of the lake acted like a massive magnifying glass, catching the light and bouncing a blindingly bright beam straight onto the polished copper disc in Zubri's hand. With a swift, incredibly precise flick of his athletic wrist, Zubri angled the disc perfectly. He caught the concentrated beam of pure, golden sunlight and reflected it directly upward, shooting it squarely into the ashen merchant's wide, unblinking silver-gray eyes. The merchant's eyes were accustomed to centuries of working in pitch darkness and feeding in the shadows. Furthermore, because he had not blinked in over a millennium, his unshielded pupils lacked any natural moisture or protective reflex against sudden, intense illumination. The bright, searing light hit his highly sensitive corneas like a physical blade made of pure fire. The ashen merchant let out a horrifying, ear-piercing scream that sounded exactly like tearing metal. The sudden, agonizing shock of the concentrated sunlight was completely unbearable. His perfect, flawless composure instantly shattered into a million pieces. The ancient, terrifying entity threw his hands up to his face, thrashing wildly. Basic, undeniable biological instinct instantly overrode centuries of dark magic. The ashen merchant's perfectly symmetrical face contorted in sheer, unadulterated agony. Unable to withstand the searing pain of the reflected sun amplified by the great lake, his long, dark eyelashes fluttered violently. With a sickeningly loud crack that echoed like thunder across the water, his heavy eyelids slammed shut. He blinked. The moment his eyes fully closed, the sacred blood pact was violently broken. The ancient, dark magic that had sustained him for 1,000 years immediately backfired with catastrophic force. A massive shockwave of crackling blue energy exploded outward from the merchant's trembling body. The sheer force of the magical blast tore across the sandy shoreline, whipping the lake into a frenzy and throwing Zubri violently backward through the air. He landed heavily in the shallow water, completely exhausted, but finally free to close his bleeding eyes. The dark sky instantly cleared, replaced by a brilliant, vibrant blue morning reflecting beautifully on the calm water. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had choked the village of Alara vanished in an instant. The unbreakable rules of the gaze of the ancients had been fully executed by the earth itself. The monster had finally lost the wager, and the catastrophic price was instantly collected. The ashen merchant collapsed heavily onto his knees in the wet sand, screaming in pain. Deprived of his magical source, his physical form began to deteriorate at a horrifying speed. His pristine, white silk linen robe rapidly rotted away, turning into filthy, algae-covered rags before the villagers' eyes. His perfectly polished mahogany skin turned completely dull, cracking deeply like parched desert mud. When he finally forced his eyes open again, the silver-gray color was completely gone, replaced by a milky, opaque white. He had been permanently blinded by the sun's powerful reflection. Simultaneously, inside the villagers' lakeside huts, every single piece of cursed gold he had traded instantly crumbled into worthless wet beach sand. The dark spell was completely broken. The life force he had stolen was instantly released, rushing back into the bodies of the entranced villagers. Color rapidly returned to their pale cheeks, and the hollow emptiness vanished in their eyes, restoring their humanity and compassion. Stripped of his power, his wealth, and his sight, the blinded merchant scrambled pathetically on his hands and knees. Whimpering like a beaten dog, he crawled slowly away from the village, banishing himself to wander the treacherous mangrove swamps forever as a miserable, powerless outcast trapped by the Great Lake. The lakeside village of Alara was completely silent as the terrifying reality of what had just happened washed over them. The oracle walked slowly across the wet sand, her staff tapping softly against the earth. She knelt beside Zubri, who was resting in the shallow water, his eyes blissfully closed in deep, glorious rest. She gently wiped the dried blood from his face and placed a cool, soothing herbal poultice over his severely damaged eyelids. As if responding to the ancient healing magic, a gentle, warm rain suddenly began to fall from the clear sky, washing away the last remnants of the merchant's dark corruption from the sandy shoreline. The massive lake, which had turned stagnant and foul, miraculously cleared up, becoming crystal blue and teeming with fresh, silver fish bursting back to life. The villagers slowly gathered around Zubri on the beach, overwhelming shame and deep sorrow filling their hearts as they realized the horrifying depth of their own greed and the massive, agonizing sacrifice this young fisherman had made to save them all. When Zubri finally opened his eyes, his vision was perfectly clear and fully healed. He looked up to see the entire village, including his older brother, kneeling humbly before him in the wet sand, weeping tears of profound, genuine gratitude. Following that terrible night on the shore, Zubri did not ask to become a king or a wealthy leader. He simply returned to his quiet life, remaining a humble, hard-working fisherman in a coarse-weave ochre-orange tunic. However, he was forever revered as the greatest hero the village of Alara had ever known. The elders passed down his incredible story for generations, ensuring that the dark mistakes of their past were never repeated beside the Great Lake. As for the Ashen Merchant, legends say he still wanders the deepest, darkest parts of the mangrove swamp, a blind beggar desperately searching for the souls he lost, forever trapped in endless darkness. The tale of the greedy heart and the unblinking eye leaves us with a powerful, timeless lesson. True wealth is absolutely never the glittering gold that dazzles and blinds your eyes like the sun reflecting on the water, but rather the quiet vigilance and courage that protects your immortal soul. The enemy does not always come with a sword. Sometimes it comes offering a crown. What illusion of wealth or comfort is blinding you today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know exactly what profound lesson you took from Zubri's incredible courage. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it.